Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Multi-Faith Conversations with Our Neighbors. My name is Andrew Hanauer. I am the president and CEO of a multi-faith organization called the One America Movement, and I'm so grateful to be with you all today. Today we are going to be having three great folks come together across faith lines to talk about issues of faith, and particularly, why God allows suffering in the world. And I know we're coming to this conversation at a time of great division in our country, on the eve of a very divisive election. And I think it's a really important time to be having conversations like this. It's an important time to be having conversations, not just with people who think like us, worship like us, vote like us, but with people who are our neighbors, but who come from different perspectives. So thank you all for being here with us today. I want to give our three panelists a chance to introduce themselves. Fahad, would you like to go first?
Sure. So my name is Fahad Taslim. I'm here representing Masjid As-Salam, or it's also known as Champions Masjid, although people kind of take that as a bit, hey, that sounds a bit arrogant, but it's the area that we live in is called Champions. So although the people of the mosque might actually think they are really champions, but anyhow, so I'm here representing the Muslim community, and just a little bit about myself. I'm married. I have 5 beautiful children, and I've been part of this community at least for, let's say, 3 or 4 years. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself.
Great, thank you. Pastor Chris Hall.
Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Pastor Chris Hall. I get to serve as the missions pastor at Houston Northwest Church. Been here for a few years. Always just a joy to get to connect to the community. I would say it is the championing community. I'm actually from here, grew up just around the corner. There's a skating park right across the street from Rabbi Jonathan's synagogue that I've frequented a few times as a child, and the mosque where Fahad is at. I've drive by there on my way to my parents' house. So love every bit of the city where we all are. And I'm married. It'll be 10 years and 1 month and 2 days. So I want to make sure I've got that on the calendar. We've got 2 kids, 2 boys, 1 8 and 1 5, and they keep us pretty busy. But looking forward to a great conversation tonight.
Great, thanks, Pastor. Rabbi Jonathan Seiger.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be here with you all tonight. I am Jonathan Seiger. I am rabbi of Congregation Jewish Community North, although I think we should be maybe Congregation of Champions, because we are next to Champions Roller World. But here in the Spring Klein area, I am in my 11th year of service to the congregation and community. So I think I've gone native. I have found myself defending the honor of Buc-ee's, as well as, the Texas method of barbecue. So I think I'm settling in, and I'm very, very excited to be part of this conversation as well. I have 2 kids. They're both awesome, especially if they'll be quiet for the next 90 minutes.
Yeah, that's cool. I did a number of Zoom calls from my closet for most of March and April to avoid that very issue. Real quick before we get into it, just to ground people in the fact that despite coming from different backgrounds, we have things in common. Does anyone have any comments on the Rockets off season and or virtual learning? 2 things that all Houstonians are going through together in some form.
As long as there's not a trash can involved, the Rockets are going to be fine.
I'll second what Pastor Chris said right there. So we're good.
Growth through suffering.
There we go. Kicking it off already.
That's a great segue. The question of why God allows suffering for many years for me was a question about why my sports teams kept losing, but we're past that now. In all seriousness, it's obviously incredibly important question amidst a global pandemic and war and depression and cancer and so forth. And so it's great to have you all here tonight discussing that. I'm going to turn it over to Fahad to talk about that from the Islamic perspective, and we'll listen to him first, and then we'll go around and hear from others as well.
Sounds great. So I'm going to start how we do in the Islamic framework with just by saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All praise is due to God. and may his peace and blessings be upon the Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessing be upon him. So some years ago, my wife actually used to work in one of the hospitals in Houston. Actually, I think it was Methodist Hospital, and she was serving as a chaplain. And she would always she'd be visiting various patients, and she wasn't limited to just Muslim patients. She had a wide range of people, and a lot of times when she would be visiting patients who have cancer, she said that those were some of the most difficult conversations that she would have, because one question that would constantly come up is, why am I going through this? Right? Like, I believe in God, but why would God put me through all of this? Put my family. It doesn't. I've never done anything to deserve this. It just seems very unfair. And this was, like I said, a wide variety of people, whether they, people of faith or even people that, didn't have faith, kind of just the very idea of suffering itself. So it seemed like a good idea to speak about this just in an interfaith setting, because I know, and I'm assuming that many of us are going through the very same thing with our own communities. Now, just to present the kind of the Islamic worldview or the Islamic response to that, one way that this is presented is in a purely theological manner, in the sense that we have the idea of what we mean by God. And so typically when people think of God, they have three kind of qualities that they pit against one another, right? So one of those qualities is that God is omniscient. He's all-knowing. The second quality is that he's omnipotent. He's almighty and all-powerful. And the third quality is he's omnibenevolent. So he's all-loving or all-merciful. So the idea then arises that if there is a God who is almighty, he's able to do whatever, and there's a God who's omnibenevolent, he's all-loving and merciful, then why does evil exist? Because if it's true that God is all-loving and all-merciful, he wouldn't want evil to exist. And if he has the ability to do something about it, in which we say that he does, then he would do something about it. And yet you have evil. So why then is there evil in the first place? Now, this is what, again, philosophically, theologically, this is what's known as the logical form of the problem. And simply put, the Islamic answer goes to the qualities of God, in the sense that, when we say that we believe in God, we don't just limit it to these three qualities. In fact, we say that God has many names, by some estimates 99 and more. And so therefore, one of the other names of God is that he is Al-Hakim, or the wise. And that God, having total knowledge of everything and being wise with everything, that there is a wisdom that just because a person doesn't see the wisdom, it doesn't mean that it's lacking, right? It's one thing to understand that, okay, that I'm going through this suffering that's going on and it's affecting me deeply, but to understand that God is not just all loving and almighty, but rather he's also the wise. In fact, there's many names of God. He is As-Salam, Al-Subur, Al-Qudus, many names that God has. And so therefore, to kind of abstract three names and say, okay, well, this becomes a problem. From the Islamic framework, we say it's just an abstraction of these three names. In fact, there are many qualities of God. And one of those qualities being he's wise and there's a wisdom. Now, in terms of solving the logical problem, you could say, well, God has the picture and we merely have a pixel. And so therefore, the viewpoint that God has is one of wisdom. He can see everything. And so you cannot, as a person, make a judgment call unless you have all the facts. Because in that case, you're actually prejudging. In fact, the word prejudice comes from there, right? You prejudge something without having all the facts. So in a sense, when we're talking about suffering, you're kind of making a prejudgment without having all the facts. And therefore, what needs to be kind of accepted or known is that God has the quality of wisdom, in addition to his other names and attributes. Now, that's a kind of an easy fix for the logical problem of God. But the reality is there's also an emotive problem. Like, listen, are you really just going to tell me it's the wisdom card? You're just going to pull out the wisdom card and say, well, hey, man, God knows you don't, so just get out of my face, right? I mean, is that it? That's all you got? I mean, have you ever suffered from X, Y, and Z? And the thing is, from that perspective, the human being is always kind of looking for reasons. And if we say that God is wise, what are those wisdoms? Within the Islamic framework, there are many wisdoms that are given. Now, I'm not going to say that we have all the wisdoms of every single type of suffering that happens in the world. But the fact that within our tradition, it is replete with many types of wisdoms that God has. And those wisdoms are intricately and deeply tied with the purpose of our existence. In fact, I would say that deeply tied with what we would call fundamental existential questions. Questions about why are we here? Where are we going? And then what happens when we die? And how did we get here? So understanding that, and then understanding, well, okay, now we can see what these wisdoms might be. So in a very simple way, to kind of take those three existential questions, how do we get here? Well, God created us. All right. I'm not going to get into the proofs of all that stuff, but let's just leave it alone for right now. All right. And where are we going to go? Well, I think everyone, no matter what your faith background is, whether you're a person of faith or no faith, you understand that we're going to die. From the Islamic framework, after you die, you'll be judged. And what will you be judged upon? You'll be judged upon the very purpose of why you exist. So why do you exist? Well, the human being exists and was created to worship God. And when we say worship, the English word doesn't really capture kind of the entire scope of what we're talking about, right? So when I say worship, usually what enters into one's cognition is this idea that, you're kind of maybe singing a hymn, you're praying, but it's actually a lot broader than that. When we say worship, the Arabic word is ibadah, which means submission, surrender, love. So as a quick kind of definition, we say worship is the highest level of love coupled with the highest level of submission, right? And so when we talk about, should you love God? Well, you love God for who God is. If he created us, gave us everything we have, we didn't pay for our heart or our lungs or our ability to breathe. And so that was just given to us as a free gift in a sense. And so therefore, because of who God is, we love God. And because God is all knowing and all wise, then therefore we submit to God. And that's what we mean by worship, the highest level of love coupled with the highest level of submission. And that includes things like gratitude and things like that. Okay, so the purpose of our life is to worship God, but we've been created as free human beings. We have a free will. We have choices that we can make. And therefore, the idea of being judged upon whether you will worship God as he deserves or not has to do with yourself having a free will, and then you being in a state where it's not pure paradise and it's not pure hellfire. Let's put it that way, right? You're in this state where you're enjoying both. And so within that state, there are going to be times when things are good and there are times when things are not so good. And in both of those cases, the idea is, where are you going? Are you working for this temporary world, or are you working for what happens after you pass away? And so therefore, we understand that this is truly the purpose, then the end goal is not this world, but rather what happens after a person passes away. And so one of the wisdoms behind, let's say, and there's a lot, but I'll just mention a few here. Now that we understand our purpose and some of those existential questions, one of those purposes may be that when the human being is completely entrenched within the world, they're really busy, they got work, they got kids, they're just, everything's just happening. They don't got, so sometimes people say like, man, I don't got time for any of this, right? It's just my world is so busy. Sometimes God would kind of shake the person to bring them back to understand why they're here. Like, okay, we get you're busy, but what are you busy with? What is the value of what you're doing? So sometimes God will put a person in a position to bring them back. And therefore they're tested in some sort of calamity. And the idea behind the calamity, or the wisdom behind that calamity, is to basically bring them back to God. Another quick one that I'll mention is sometimes we ask, well, you see all of these natural disasters, and let's say people die in some sort of earthquake or a tsunami or something like that. Well, what about those people? And one of the responses that comes from our tradition is that God basically rewards every single person, or rewards a person for any sort of suffering they go through. So even the pricking of a thorn has a reward attached to it. And so therefore, when a person does suffer, that actually that happens in terms of adding to their account after they are passed away and they're getting their judgment basically meted out to them. In fact, one of the ideas behind this idea of, well, do we enter paradise with our deeds, or do we enter paradise by the mercy of God? We say that we enter paradise by the mercy of God because the fact that God gives us way more credit for the deeds that we do. So it's not just a one-to-one accounting. All right. So just to give you a quick example, when a person goes and prays in congregation, and this prayer in congregation, let's say it's the morning prayer and the evening prayer. Well, that prayer, it's given the credit as if you prayed half the night. So if you go for the morning prayer, you're written down, you're given credit as if you prayed half the night. And if you go for the evening prayer, the night prayer, in the mosque or like in the congregation, you're written as you prayed for half the night. So if a person attends just these two prayers in congregation, while they didn't spend all night up in front of God, praying to God, they get the credit for that. And so therefore, what I'm stressing at is that one of those wisdoms when it comes to the idea of God and giving credit is that even when a person suffers through anything, they are rewarded for that. And hence the Prophet Muhammad said that strange or wondrous is the fare of a believer. That when the believer is going through times of goodness, they are grateful and they're rewarded for that gratitude. And when they are going through times of difficulty, they are patient and they're rewarded for that. So it's a win-win situation, but it's also dependent on the choice that you make. Do we now start flipping out and say like, "Whoa, this is terrible," and we lose patience, or are we now steadfast on, well, there's a deeper purpose and a deeper journey that we're going upon? So I expounded upon a couple of the wisdoms. And I think I was referring to the one about the kids dying, the tsunami or whatever it might be. So there's a specific tradition where the Prophet Muhammad mentions that a person who was suffering in this world had the worst possible existence you could possibly think of, right? This person might be in the middle of a war zone. They may be, hit with a tsunami, whatever it might be. They've lost their house. This person will come on the day of judgment and they will basically be dipped once in paradise, and they'll be asked, "Did you suffer at all in this world when you were alive?" And they will say, "My Lord, I did not suffer at all," because compared to the eternal and elevated bliss of paradise, the world itself, because it's limited in time and because it's limited in its the amount of suffering you have here, it doesn't compare at all to paradise. And the people who were unjust in this world, the tyrants, the people who are just the worst of the worst, they'll be brought forth and they enjoyed their life. They had a wonderful time at the expense of other people. They'll be dipped once in the hellfire and asked, "Did you really enjoy your life at all?" And they'll say, "Nope, we didn't enjoy anything." So all of these things, again, let me just kind of wrap it up by saying, when we talk about the idea of suffering, we want to make sure that we understand who God is, that it's not just these three attributes, 2 or 3 attributes, but rather there's many attributes. He's wise. And that wisdom has to do with, the fact that you're going through this, whatever suffering it is, it has a wisdom behind it. The fact that within the Islamic tradition, some of those wisdoms are expounded upon, and that God is, at the end of the day, he's also just, as opposed to just being wise, and many names and attributes. And so when we look at things like the type of suffering, we say, okay, we're suffering injustice, but even that will be taken care of on the day of judgment. So I'll go ahead and stop there. And that's basically, I could go on and on, but, don't want to bore you guys too much. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fahad. I really appreciate it. And I mean, this is a topic that obviously we could have a marathon 48-hour Zoom conversation and not exhaust the material. So appreciate you putting so much into it. Pastor Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. As I was just listening to Fahad's statements and comments, there's certainly a bit of commonality in the way we foresee and understand what suffering is on humanity. as I was just kind of thinking through this week about suffering, it's one of those things in life where we all kind of are recognize is occurring, no matter who we are, what we believe, don't believe, where we're from, our backgrounds or our futures. It is inevitable. And like I said, it's one of the few commonalities between religions. We're seeing that it doesn't take much to find it. Certainly in my own personal life, in suffering through job loss. I'll never forget getting laid off at about the same time my wife found out she was pregnant with her first child. We knew it was coming, but nevertheless, it certainly stung when you open up the envelope and says, good luck. Hurricane Harvey 3 years ago in Houston. I mean, everybody in Houston can relate to that. And another is I'll never forget opening up an email from somebody we work with overseas saying that someone in their church died of starvation. And I think, why me? Why them? What did they do to deserve something like that? Why did God place that on those individuals at that time? Why did it? Because it affects not just them, but their families and the communities that they live in. But it comes down to, I'm not God, and I just don't know. I can't fully explain why suffering occurs in those types of situations, because in him lies full authority over his creation. We believe as Christians that God created humanity, and he has authority over us, whether or not we choose to follow him, and he will do with us as he pleases as creator. It's easy to say, but it's certainly hard to accept that. Especially when you're going through it. But what we do know is that God is not the author of evil. He is the opposite of God is not suffering. He did not create suffering, but he permits suffering here on this earth. Suffering occurs when we take our view off of God, but not the sole reason why suffering occurs in this life. It's analogy I have heard in the past is when you are driving your car and you refuse to wear your seatbelt and you get in an accident and you're injured, you can't blame anybody but yourself. You're the reason for your suffering. However, if you are the safest driver on the planet, wear your seatbelt constantly, and someone hits you at no fault of your own, the fact is suffering will still occur. And it's just no matter the cause, suffering will happen. More so, what the Western world views as suffering is rarely what is described in the scriptures. I think often we will categorize our personal struggles with the suffering that we see in the text. We see that Jesus tells his followers that they are going to endure suffering as his followers, as they go about sharing his truth and his salvation to the world. That suffering will occur. However, he does promise them a way to endure that challenge and a way to endure that suffering. He does not leave us alone. And as regardless of why that suffering may come, we see that it develops a godly character. Christians, we live according to the scripture, counterculture to the rest of the world, the ways of the world. So we will find ourselves inevitably up against hurdles. Jesus commands us to love our neighbor and love our enemy at the same time, with the same type of love. And if we're going to do that, suffering is certainly bound to occur. A.W. Tozer says this: to be right with God has often meant to be in trouble with men. And so we have a choice. who will we be right before? Will we be right before God, our Creator, or men, the created beings? Job, the prophet, says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Essentially, Job is saying that none of this was mine to begin with, and when I leave, it won't be mine in the end. It is a gift the Lord has given. As Job has struggled through that, as he worked through that suffering, praying to God and trying to understand why, in those struggles, he still recognized from the very beginning that it was the Lord's to begin with. The other reason why God allows suffering is because he loves his creation. It sounds counter to the argument, but it is a sign of free will. God has given us the freedom to choose. God has given us the freedom to choose the choices that we make as individuals. And free will, if we never chose to look away from God or to sin, I wonder, would we be asking ourselves, why does God allow love? If we never sinned, would we ask ourselves that question? Why does God allow us to receive love or have love in our lives? No, because we would not be able to recognize a loving relationship. That's the beauty of free will, is that we are able to see the difference, the distinction between what is from God and what is not. Western culture develops this idea that something or someone else is the cause of my suffering. If you look in the creation story in Genesis 3, we see Adam blaming Eve for the sin, and Eve blaming the serpent for her sin. And at the end of the day, mankind blames God's perfect creation, which reflects our blame towards God himself. And we need to maybe redirect some of that blame back to our own personal choices that we're making. And then also it's just a mystery. Sometimes God is causes suffering for unknown reasons. For example, a very personal story. My wife suffered a miscarriage, not recently, but certainly in our marriage, and it was a struggle because my question to God was, well, what did she do wrong to have to receive that kind of punishment, to receive that kind of suffering? But the way I perceive good and the way God perceives good are very different things. It was certainly a difficult time, and the unknown that still exists and probably always will. But my living good or godly does not guarantee blessing. I can't twist God's arm into making me happy. So what does this mean for God's people as we finish up here? Is that sin has allowed suffering to enter the world. God desires for us to fully know him, though, in light of that sin. To do so, he willingly entered our world full of suffering and suffered alongside us. The suffering servant made hope known even during his own suffering, as he was suffering alongside us and serving God's people. He continued to make known the hope of God. And we as Christians would say this suffering servant is the Christ. Suffering, and Christ's suffering was to take on my own suffering and to take on your own suffering. This is what he does at the cross, not for my own works, but for his willingness to show how to have hope in light of suffering. He emptied himself. He left heaven for my salvation, for your salvation. And as he's on the cross, he is rejected by God. And he does this willingly and suffers out of love. And so in light of that, if as Christians, we are called to suffer alongside Christ and to give up everything for the glory of God. This is what we would consider our suffering. And it's a temporary suffering. He has promised us that the eternal celebration will far outweigh my momentary struggles. Those struggles, just like my earthly happiness, are temporary. they shape me, but they do not define me. It is God and it is his calling on me through Christ that will define me and will allow me to live this life through struggle and through whatever may come my way. But it is my purpose to see that he is made known regardless of what may occur in where I am or who it is I'm around, to continue to make that known.
Pastor, thank you. Really, really good stuff. And thanks for also, sharing personal stories in the midst of this. I think it really helps folks kind of see this isn't just theory and theology. It's not a seminary off or whatever you want to call it. It's really, really applicable to the lives that we live. I'm going to turn it over to the rabbi in a second. I know Fahad is going to have to duck out here for a minute. Fahad, you want to give a 30-second explanation for why you're not leaving because you're offended by what the rabbi is about to say?
It was actually Chris. How could you? No, I'm kidding. No. So our prayer at sundown is going to be coming in a few minutes here. So I just wanted to go out, catch that, and come right back. So I'm not leaving at all. In fact, I'd like to actually stay for what Rabbi Jonathan is going to say, and then I'll just cut out after that if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so I'm going to stick around for that, and then I'll cut out.
I don't have authority to make decisions. That sounds great, Rabbi Jonathan Seiger. Go ahead. We turn it over.
Thank you so much. First, just what great, what tremendous offerings my two holy brothers have given us tonight. What great stuff. I usually on these panels have to go first because they're sort of going in the order of Abrahamic faiths, which sometimes is annoying, but now it's the other way. There's so many good things that as Fahad and Chris are speaking, that's great. That's a great point. I kind of wish that it could be like hypertext, when you read an article and you click on this link, because then you can footnote and be like, ooh, this is neat. Like in Hebrew, the word avodah or avdut, it means service, worship. Our word for worship means service, but actually like doing a job, like being a servant and serving somebody, or in this case, serving God. And in that context, I think it fits very nicely into the conversation. I don't think I'll have too much to say because there's room for conversation. And I hope no one viewing or anyone participating here will be too surprised that there's an awful lot of similarities between Judaism and Christianity and Islam. There's a reason we're sister faiths. One of the things when we talk about suffering, there's probably no more immediate relatable occurrence than the death of someone we love, in terms of the deepest suffering, confronting death. And one of the things that we say is traditionally Baruch Dayan Emet. And we say that whenever we get bad news. Praised is the true judge. God help us, it shouldn't be that someone dies. You can also get it if you have a business fail, something bad happens. The bad news blessing, and there's a blessing for everything. Like there are 99 glorious names of God, there's at least that many blessings. We say praised is the true judge, which means praised is whatever that power is that can understand these things, because it's beyond our comprehension many times. We don't understand why people suffer. The philosophical name for this kind of study is theodicy, not the Odyssey, the story from Homer, but theodicy, justifying God's ruling, justifying why bad things happen to good people. And appropriately, we can look at our father Abraham as the first example of this. Within the text of the Torah, we read about Abraham being given a multitude of tests, starting with leaving his home and everything he knew and leaving his father's house and going to a new land, having to journey to Egypt, having to fight wars, dealing with famines, all of the things that he had to deal with, small inconveniences to really large ones, culminating, of course, with the final trial. And this is where Fahad will walk out. I'm kidding. When in Jewish tradition, it's Isaac, his son Yitzchak. Of course, as I understand it in Islamic tradition, it's Ishmael, the son who was offered up as a sacrifice, or nearly sacrificed, as a sign of Abraham's faith and trust in God, and a sign of how deeply committed he is to the relationship he has with God, how willing he is to give up the most precious thing he owns. The very thing that, as human beings and as men, perhaps, maybe that's a little bit old-fashioned to say, his legacy, like his firstborn, most precious heir, he's willing to give that up, like the most human sort of visceral feeling. And he is, in fact, rewarded for this. And our holy rabbis, the ancient rabbis, say, why would God, if God loves Abraham, and Abraham's his first prophet and loves God, why would he do that to him? And the rabbis have a wonderful answer. They I don't know if it's satisfactory, but it's a wonderful answer. They say the reason God tests us is the same reason and way that a craftsman tests his merchandise. It's the old guy walking around the car lot kicking the tires to show you how solid he is. In a marketplace, they would take an earthenware jug and they'd slap it with a stick. If it shatters when you give it a thwack, it's not a very good jug or piece of pottery. If it can take a shot, quality Mesopotamian craftsmanship. Flax, the more you beat flax, the shinier and the better it gets, and you can make nicer linen out of it. Now, again, that's kind of disturbing, but the idea they're getting to is that trial breeds character. When you go through suffering, when you go through difficult times, challenge makes you better and stronger. And in return, or actually as an extension, it makes you a better servant of God. The same thing you see in seminary. I can't speak for any of you all watching here, but they kind of put you through the ringer sometimes. And you say, why are you doing this to us? You're giving us more than we can handle. And you say, what do you think is going to happen in a congregation? What do you think is going to happen when you're thrown into a situation where you feel totally overwhelmed? It's a way of developing. It's a way of maximizing your potential and actually being who you're meant to be. And growth is painful and growth is challenging. And sometimes it's frustrating and sometimes you fail. And you got to learn how to do that in order to reach your full potential. The second interpretation of that is that our actions have consequences. What happens to us, we don't know the connection with the past or the future. So let me go from Abraham to another biblical example, the Egyptians' enslavement of the Israelites. So our shared ancestors, the Israelites, in one way or another, spiritual or otherwise, suffered under Egyptian slavery for 20 generations. That's a long time. You'd think the point would have probably been made in, I think probably if I was enslaved for about 6 months or maybe even 3 days, I'd be ready to go. But 400 years is a long time. Why did they suffer so long? Well, one of the explanations is so that the ultimate redemption is that much more miraculous. And in particular, it's not so much that they were ultimately freed, it's that the Israelites never forgot who they were. The reason that Jewish people bless their sons and say, may you be like Ephraim and Manasseh, is because they never forgot who they were, even when they were basically being treated as if not Egyptian royalty, but definitely VIPs in Egypt because of their father, Yosef. They never forgot who they were. They had Hebrew names. They passed it on. They never forgot. And when the Israelites were freed, we know that they gave Moses a hard time, but the fact is there was enough of a spark that remained, that even after that much slavery, there was enough there to rekindle and continue the relationship and continue on. And so here's what's really neat. This idea that history is bigger than we can perceive it. There's this idea that we're given in Jewish tradition that it sounds cool in Hebrew, so I'll share. Ein mukdam u'me'ohar b'Torah. There's no before or after in Torah. Things happen at the same time. I mean, it looks like it's happening in Exodus, and then it's happening in Deuteronomy, or it's happening in Genesis, and later it's happening in Leviticus, or 1,000 years later. And yet they're happening at the same time if you're far enough away from it, like if you have God's view of creation. So it's taught that Abraham's blade parries Pharaoh. When Pharaoh says, let's go kill those Israelites, it said he unsheaths his sword and he takes his army and he chases after the Israelites. And you've probably seen the movie with Charlton Heston or the cartoon, and they go into the Red Sea. But it's said that Abraham's sword, when Abraham takes his knife in order to sacrifice his son, what he's actually doing is knocking Pharaoh's blade away. His parrying his sword or his knife, his blade parries Pharaoh's blade. They're separated by the better part of 1,000 years. And yet an action we take, a suffering we undergo, has echoes and has consequences in the future. Our behavior and our actions have long reaching consequences. And so we have to be able to view it that way. We may not understand why things are happening to us. We just have to do our best to endure and try to get some growth out of it. And sometimes the only thing we can do is help someone else through suffering. And that's a good thing to do. That means we're servants of God. We are representing God. We're acting on behalf of the merciful one who is to be praised. We're acting on behalf of the prophets we admire and adorate. We're saying we're doing what they would want us to do. The book of Job, and I'm thrilled to come back to Job. I knew it would get raised. We just did a close study of the book of Job in our community. And Job gives us a very different answer. Job's kind of a troubling book. If you sit down and really read Job, it's not very satisfactory, and it's a difficult book because it leaves an awful lot of things unresolved. But I think that's part of its brilliance. Now, again, I feel obligated to quote the rabbis and say, hey, they point out that they believe that Job was an allegory. We weren't supposed to take it as like history, but there's a debate. Some people say, no, Job is real and it really happened, and you need to pay attention. Others had say, that's really not the point of the story. Let's go to the deeper wisdom in it. Like they're using it as an example because we can all feel like Job sometimes. But the reason that they struggle with it is because the answer ultimately, if you remember the book of Job, is, were you there when I set everything up? I mean, you got up today. The sun was there. Did you do anything to control that? I mean, rain, oceans. Do you have anything to do with that? Any of this? So who are you to question anything that happens? You're lucky to be here. All of the things that you get in life, all the lucky and the beautiful things that you're able to experience, what have you really done to earn that? You're just given that. So you should actually just be thankful for it and say thank you and take what comes. And that is, in a sense, what happens. Now, I think this is important. God also blesses Job. If you remember, Job's friends say, oh, you did something wrong and God is punishing you. And Job said, no, I didn't do anything wrong and God is punishing me, and I'm really mad about that. God says, you don't have a right to complain, but you are right. You didn't necessarily do anything wrong. And your friends, I'm gonna punish them. You better pray for your friends. It's fascinating, and we can find humor in it. And I think there's sort of a Jewish genius for humor because it has helped us deal with it. And our relationship with God can be comic and even in tragic circumstances. I mean, Job is an example of that. God doesn't say Job is wrong for complaining, that he is getting sort of a raw deal, but he still has no room to complain. And that's sort of the challenge. We can hold on to those things. And sometimes we suffer and we don't really know why. And we can't see why there is a reason for it. But that doesn't mean that we get to give up. And it doesn't mean that we get to think that God doesn't care. God does care. It's just that God is far greater than us, has a much broader view of what's happening. And to sort of come back around, because you may feel a little suspended and turned around by me talking about Job, because I think we're supposed to. It's not easily resolvable. What it comes down to at the end is that God does care, and Job's suffering becomes an example for us. We're reading this, just as I said, you don't know what's going on, how it's going to affect people down the line. We look at Job and take strength from his perseverance and the fact that he never gives up on God. He says, I'd like an audience. I'd like to plead my case. I'd really like him to answer me. God says, you're not entitled to answers from me. I don't answer to you, but I do care about you. It's very parental. I mean, it's just tough. It's a great book, though, because what it tells us is this is not the first time we've had this conversation. We've been having the same conversation for thousands of years and trying to figure out why. And we've come up with good answers, I think. We just don't have one that is going to be perfect for everyone. I do want to share one thought because I think it does come up in Job. And it's related to something that a Buddhist friend taught me, even though I'm not a Buddhist. But they talk about suffering being a symptom of attachment. When you're attached to things being your way, when you're attached to having control over things, when you're attached to objects and people and don't realize that everything is God's and God can do with it what God is going to do with it, that can be a pathway to suffering. And once you're able to let go and let God and just sort of do what you believe is expected of you by your community, by your religious tradition, by your family, by your own relationship with God, and let go of the things that you really can't control, you'll find yourself more at peace. And that again comes back to, I believe Pastor Chris raised that, the Adonai Natan. God has given, God has taken away. What can we do? Bless the name of God. I bless the name of God who has given of his wisdom to flesh and blood. That's it. That's all I got.
No, that's great, Rabbi. I love this this idea of God and humans having had the same conversation over and over again for thousands of years, which is similar to what I say to my children a lot, and still have the same conversations. Rabbi, thank you, thank you all. We're now going to shift into a period of conversation, and thank you also to the folks commenting on the live stream with their encouragement. We're grateful to have you with us, and thanks for being here. Does anyone want to start with a question for one of your colleagues?
So, Andrew, real quick, I've got a whole bunch of questions, but I'm going to cut out now and I'll be right back. So is that cool? So go ahead and get the conversation going, and then I'm going to run out and I'll be back in a few minutes. That's cool.
All right. We won't prank you and all disappear. Does anyone else want to start with a question?
I think that, yeah.
Go for it. Go for it.
So I think that's, one of the things that's so interesting to me is that at least in my education is always sort of encouraged that, sometimes it's not finding the right answer, right? It's finding the right question, because that leads to the conversation. Like when we see things and we say, well, this is the answer, as opposed to the question, the sort of the journey is the purpose. Which is sort of a preamble to this. One of the things that I find fascinating, and I'd love to hear more about, because it's not something I hear spoken about in the circles I travel in, is of course the idea of within Christianity about the church being, I guess I'm using the fancy term, the Catholic, meaning the body. Like we talk about Catholic Israel, the people of Israel, not the Catholic Church, but like the body of Christ, right? And I use that term intentionally. I mean, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, being that I'm, Jewish. Like, how does that play out? How do you see that playing out, especially when you see, such a diversity of opinions and communities? I'm just curious how you approach that. When people are so divided as to what that might mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the division that we see in what you're saying is the Catholic Church, or what we would, another word for that is the unified church. There's certainly a number of divisions through history, and I would, we could talk for a long time about how those came to be and their justification or lack thereof at some points with those divisions. But on the Protestant end of Christianity, regardless of denomination, Baptist, Lutheran, Methodist, etc., I think you would hear a similar thread of agreement when it comes to suffering. You would hear that Jesus is that suffering servant that we are all called to follow, and that we are reading the same text that tells us to take up our cross and to follow him. We are all reading that Jesus saying, my yoke is easy, my way is light. And so those same types of statements are in agreement in one way or another. And that was the idea of what suffering is, or why it exists, doesn't really vary. You could talk to your favorite Lutheran pastor or your best Methodist friend, and they may share a different viewpoint, which is fine, but not a whole lot of differing views, at least when it comes to suffering from denomination to denomination.
Cool. It's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
guess it makes sense. I mean, I guess I'm not really that surprised, but there's such a diversity.
Yeah, there's a few of us out there, and I think that it's a valid conversation to look at why that is the current situation that we're in, and it could be a helpful conversation. But we're all willing to recognize that suffering is out there. It's how do we respond to it is the cornerstone conversation that I think is helpful. And how do we deal with it? So
I think that's fascinating, right? I mean, it's sort of, I haven't run into too many people, but I can't imagine there are people that are so callous that they say, well, this person's suffering it's almost like the Job response. Well, they must have done something. Why should I alleviate it? That's, they should pray about it.
yeah, I mean, it's funny. Just real quick, that statement, you should just pray about it and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
I don't think any one of us, at least on this panel, would want to minimize the strength and power of prayer. However, there is a call to response of loving your neighbor. And I mean, not just, hey, I'm going to pray for you, but hey, I'm going to get down to where you are and come alongside you in your despair, the opposite of what Job's friends do, and say, I'm going to walk through you in these trenches and see that you are not subject to despair and loneliness in this time. I know there's nothing I can do to pull you out of it physically within my own strength and my own might. But I do know that coming alongside and having community is a powerful thing. And so there is that aspect of prayer, but there's also this aspect of serving with action that is just as needed in that time. So there's that, and I'm obviously biased towards the Christian faith, but it would teach us that the only true understanding of what that relationship can look like is through Christ. And he saw me in my despair and my suffering, and as an act of love came down and not just said, hey, I'm going to pray for you, which he does, but he also comes alongside us and says, I'm going to show you the direction in which you're supposed to go.
Thanks, Pastor. Before we turn back to questions for each other, I wanted to, actually bring up that question. If you believe in a benevolent God, in one line, what is your explanation for why there's human suffering? But I think we're going to give you guys 10 minutes to think that over, so you come up with a good one line. So why don't you ask each other a couple questions, and then we'll come back to Robert's question. Robert, thank you so much for asking. And we'll have our one line answers by then.
All right. I just wanted to piggyback off of something what Pastor Chris mentioned. Is that, if you remember, I was talking about the Islamic framework of understanding that we have a purpose, and that purpose has to do with you being tested. So sometimes what happens is that it's not necessary that you're the one that's actually suffering, but what is your reaction and what do you do when someone else is suffering? So that's something that you as an individual are also questioned about. So it's not just like, okay, so what is the meaning of my suffering, but what is the meaning of another person's suffering? And then what is my reaction to that? So basically, if your reaction is nothing, that's something you'll be held accountable for. If your reaction is, well, let's walk hand in hand with this person, try to go deeper, then of course, again, I'm going to reiterate what Pastor Chris was saying, is that of course we pray for this person, but beyond that, to try to walk with them hand in hand and try to, have a, like a shoulder to cry on or whatever it might be. That's something that from the Muslim standpoint that we'll be asked about, right? Like, what did you, when that person was going through whatever they're going through, what did you do or what did you not do? And you'll be judged upon that. So I think it was beautiful what Pastor Chris mentioned. I think it's really important that, we can look at it from kind of a, I guess maybe society in general causes us to look at things like, well, my suffering, right? But usually, sometimes it's not only about our suffering, it's about what other people are going through as well. And it's kind of it's part and parcel of the Islamic faith to understand that, and then to understand that, well, another person's suffering could have ramifications on you personally. So even if it is about you, your reaction to the other person might actually be something that'll help you, or might be something that may harm you in the long run. So I think that was really spot on. So do you mind if I ask a question? Is that, are we just going open here? Okay. All right. So I had a question. So for Pastor Chris, I know you mentioned free will, and I was reading about Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. I don't know if you're familiar with it. He's a really strong Christian philosopher, and I really benefited a lot from his work. And the argument that he makes, in terms of like how, like what is the purpose of suffering, or what is the purpose of evil, or like how do we explain evil? He basically boils it down to the idea of free will. That if there was no evil and we lived in pure bliss, then really your choice is good and good. And so therefore that's not really a choice. So I guess my question would be from a Christian world. So I see that from an Islamic worldview, because again, we're judged for the actions that we do, and therefore our moral choices have ramifications. Coming from a Christian point of view, do moral choices have ramifications once one considers the sacrifice from your perspective of Jesus dying, and suffering and so on and so forth? Then what is the value of those moral choices from that perspective? Like, what is the value of the free will, I guess is what I'm trying to, hope that was clear. I didn't know if that was.
Yeah, I mean, and if I don't answer it correctly, just tell me that the answer was great, make me feel good afterwards. Okay. But no, there's this kind of a desire that once we hear the goodness of Christ's salvation, that, hey, I want that, because this hell thing doesn't sound very thrilling, right? I'd like to avoid, eternal damnation. And so, yeah, let me run towards Christ, but also let me still continue to live in the way I desire. Because I get to choose, right? It's my will, but I'm going to choose Christ, and I'm going to choose my own personal entertainment, so to speak. But you can't serve two masters. You either have to pick one or the other at the end of the day. And so there is this idea that, if I'm going to commit to Christ, I'm committing everything to Christ. And my free will, while I can still choose, and I can still open to sinning, that's still part of my life. I'm going to do everything I can to adjust my personal way of life, my living towards Christ. And that is a sign of God's goodness in my life. And I want that example to shine through. In light of, even if it's suffering, if it's temporary happiness, regardless of what comes my way, I see that Christ is bigger than those things. And that is what will be magnified in who I am and what I'm about. And so I think sometimes Christianity, we can get stuck on, this free will thing, and say, hey, I still get to choose. And that is part of it, and that's in Christian theology. But if we're not careful as Christians, we can turn free will into our idol and start running that direction, trying to make that my justification for the things that I'm doing in my life, instead of I am going to die to myself and live towards Christ.
Yeah, that was great. Great. So if anyone wants to ask me anything, I'm good.
So,
or
Fahad, I'm curious, as you were talking about being dipped in paradise and being dipped in at the end of your life, it sounds like there is a dual in the Islamic faith, and this is maybe a totally ignorant question, so just if you could roll with me for a second.
Sure.
There's a dual pathway to paradise.
Okay.
If I've done good deeds and I'm accepted into paradise based on those deeds, or I've never followed those things and I'm given the choice at the end of my life based on a dip in hell, of course I'm not going to pick that. I'm going to run the other direction. Right. So in either way, it's my choosing where I desire to live out eternity.
Sure.
Can you kind of flesh that out a little bit?
Sure. So I think I may have not been very clear with the example itself. So basically, what I was trying to do was compare kind of two people that have kind of lived their life in two different scenarios. So one was someone that basically has lived their life, and we're talking after they have died is what I was talking about in terms of being dipped in paradise and dipped in hellfire. So the person that lived their life where they were able to enjoy everything, not that there's anything wrong with enjoying things, but at the expense of, let's say, others, and at the expense of a disobedience to God. And so they were able to acquire their wealth through means that, where other people were oppressed or whatever it might be. And they were just kind of very tyrannical. So this person, on the day of judgment, they're basically dipped in hellfire and said, look, did you really have any enjoyment? As if to say, like, look, was it really worth it to disobey God and, oppress the people that you oppressed, and so on and so forth? The flip side of that is that when a person who was, let's say, living their life and they had for all intents and purposes, a miserable existence. So they were in the middle of a war zone. They were, they went through a famine, and they ended up in dying in an earthquake, let's say. So this person, they, on the day of judgment, because they were patient with all of that, and they understood that life is not just about this temporary world, because they were patient and they still obeyed God, they'll be dipped in paradise and then asked, did you really suffer at all? And having tasted paradise, they'll say, my Lord, I didn't suffer at all. So that was the example, and it's in terms of, I hope I'm clear with the example itself, is kind of juxtaposing two different scenarios where a person makes a choice to either obey God or reject God. And so for the one that obeys God, even when they are going through suffering, and it may go back to what Rabbi Jonathan was mentioning about Job, that even the fact that, at least from our tradition, Job sticks to his guns all the way through to the end, right? And that's basically, and that's one of the reasons why he's considered a prophet, and prophets from our perspective are the best of humanity. And really, when you look at least from the Islamic perspective, Job is one of the best of humanity, because everything that he went through, he was still obedient to God. And that was really what really makes Job, again, from our perspective. So the idea is that when a person's patient, the purpose of that suffering throughout all of their life is that idea of a test. And every person is tested in one way or another in almost every situation. Some people are tested with an immense amount of suffering. But, some of the scholars within the Islamic framework mention that a harder test, in fact, is when life is actually going good. Because that's when a person starts to, take things for granted. And you see this a lot with children, especially, when people talk about, like, oh, my son or my daughter's so entitled, right? Well, what is that? It's just this expectation that, well, I deserve this, right? And so when a person is kind of in that state where just everything is happening, everything is good, that may be more of a difficult test to turn around and say, you know, I should be grateful for this. I should be someone who obeys God. I should share this, and so on and so forth. So again, I was just trying to juxtapose those two different scenarios where you have a person who lives their life obedient to God, no matter what situation they're in, whether they're in a situation of goodness or a situation of deep difficulty, and a person who disobeys God in a situation of goodness and or in a situation of deep difficulty as well. Because we believe that a person could be in a state of deep difficulty and still be disobedient to God by just giving up and saying, you know, why would God do this to me? And, you know, I don't need to believe in God, and I don't need to do any of this. And, you know, it's all about me, myself, and I. So that worship of the self overtakes the worship of God. So
it's that I just as a quick note, if I had, what you just said reminded me of, and I don't have the source in front of me, I'll have to look it up, but there was this, I can't remember where it came from, but it's someone said that the greatest sin that a Jewish person can commit is despair, which I thought was really profound. I mean, obviously,
Sure.
like, you know, murder, like,
Right.
Let's not take it literally, okay? Like, there are definitely like things that objectively are worse where human beings are concerned, okay? So there are many worse sins you can commit against a human being, but of the sins that we can commit against God, despair is the one of it, because it signifies that we've given up any sense of hope or trust. And I think it speaks to what you're saying about Job, who Job is unhappy, but he doesn't, I mean, he despairs his lot, but he doesn't despair of God. He doesn't actually, you know, he never breaks faith. He's just unhappy. And he's given a bit of that room, but he's called on it. No, I think what you said is profound. And it did remind me of that idea and that's something we have to fight against. If I can, one of the things also, which is interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And I so appreciate this opportunity, because I think these are not conversations that we often have or get the space to have.
No.
That Judaism certainly has a very, you know, old and rich tradition, and a lot of different traditions. And to be completely honest, they've been inspired and influenced by everything going back to, you know, Egypt, to certainly the Arab world and Islam and Christianity, Christian Europe. I mean, you know, our thoughts about the afterlife and what happens has changed. I mean, my rabbinic thesis was about a Jewish version of Dante's Inferno, which is based on Muhammad, peace be upon him's night journey. I mean, you know, so it's both, and it's drawing off Jewish experience. Is that the sense of this focus on the afterlife, that don't worry about the suffering in this world, because you're going to be rewarded for it in the afterlife. Like, this is all just an antechamber to paradise. And that exists in Judaism. I don't mean to suggest that it doesn't, but it is not something, certainly in what I would consider, you know, we would say progressive Jewish communities, something that we emphasize. There's a reason that our traditional salute is l'chaim, to life. Right? Like, the idea is that we're supposed to enjoy life. Life is supposed to be nice. Life is not supposed to simply be like a trial by which you're rewarded in the afterlife. We certainly hope that that's the case and believe that there's more to it. But I'm curious, because obviously, as you know, a person that's not deeply ensconced in the Christian or Islamic world, it could certainly seem like there's an awful lot of emphasis on de-emphasizing this mortal life and really just, you know, focus on what happens after you die.
Sure. So, do you want to go first, Pastor Chris? Or
I was going to say, yeah, I think there is a certain emphasis on, hey, let me just get you to heaven and everything will be okay. Let me just get you there. And if I can get you to do these things to get you into heaven, then I've done my job, my duty to God. And certainly we don't want to de-emphasize the beauty of eternal community with God, and being able to sit with him in heaven and worship him for eternity. However, there is still this opportunity to show ourselves obedient to God and to what he has called us to do. Love your Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. You probably have heard those things a time or two. But in doing that here in the life that we are currently in, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, that was his desire, was to be with God face to face in heaven. And God's response, and I'm paraphrasing at this point, but was, no, your place at this point in time is to be there on earth and to worship me in that place. Because we so often forget that the earth that we're in is fallen. However, it is still a remnant of God's beautiful creation, and that we are still able to worship him even in the brokenness that we are living in, and that we should be able to still find opportunity to worship him here in this life and the one that he gives us in the thereafter.
Okay, wonderful. So, Rabbi Jonathan, what you mentioned, I think it's really interesting because a lot of like young Muslims, they'll ask this, like, man, why is everything in our religion, the word is haram, right? Forbidden, right? And we usually tell them, we say, if you really think about it, there's more that's allowed than is actually forbidden. It's just, you just focus on the forbidden, right? Like, why can't we drink alcohol? Why can't we eat pork? Well, those are the things you can't do, but you can literally do everything else and eat everything else, right? Well, it's interesting. There's a supplication that's mentioned in the Quran, and I think it kind of goes to answer that. And the supplication is basically, and I'll say the Arabic really quick. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Oh, our Lord, give us the best of this life and give us the best of the afterlife, and do not punish us, right? So the idea from the Islamic framework is not to just leave off this life and say, okay, well, we're just looking for the afterlife, and this life just has no value whatsoever. In fact, that would be a complete error, because this life, as one of the scholars said, it is mazra'atul akhirah. It is the seed bed for the hereafter. So in the sense that the focus, it shouldn't be 100% on this life. It shouldn't be, so focused on the afterlife that you forget this life. One of the things that's really interesting, remember we were talking about choices and making moral choices. And the fact that when you make a moral choice, you're rewarded for that. And therefore you see that on the day of judgment, you made all these moral choices. So there was a time when the Prophet Muhammad was sitting with his companions, and he told his companions, when you have intercourse with your wife, you're rewarded for that. And they were shocked. Like, wait a minute, we're rewarded for something like that? I mean, it feels so good. It's great. He said, yes, because if you made the choice to have intercourse outside of marriage, you'd be punished for that, right? So it's not that it's the idea of, okay, well, just forget the world, but the idea that, look, the world has its share and you're supposed to focus on it to some extent, but don't be so engrossed with this temporary world that you completely forget that which is eternal. So.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. All right, you've evaded long enough. It's time to get to Robert's question. I don't know if we can bring it back up onto the screen, but wow, magic of technology. Robert, again, thank you for the question. What is your best one-liner on why there is human suffering when we believe in a benevolent God? So I'm going to ask you all to do this in one sentence with no semicolons. Rabbi, you want to go first?
Sure. It's not my one-liner. That's the beauty of it. It's Rabbi Yanai, a 3rd century religious scholar. He said, "It is not in our power to explain the success of the wicked or the suffering of the righteous."
Nice.
Thank you.
Like
yeah,
that.
Appreciate it. Pastor?
In one sentence, in one line, human suffering exists to show that God is still bestows compassion on us in light of my sin, in light of my shortcomings.
Thanks, Pastor. Fahad.
All right, so I'm gonna take one directly out of the Quran, and that is, he's like, that's not fair.
Quote Quran.
Hang on,
man,
I got a book too. Wait, here's my book.
Well, you guys had the opportunity to do it, man.
I know, it's fine. I did. I quoted Mishnah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. No, so basically, the Quran states, it says that perhaps there is something that you hate, but it's good for you, and perhaps there's something that you love, but it's evil for you. Wallahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun. But God knows, and your knowledge is limited. So that's pretty much it.
Love that. Like vegetables.
Yeah.
Yeah, vegetables.
It's great.
I want to turn it back over to you if you have more questions for each other. I also want to just ask, in lieu of that, if you are out of questions, if folks want to share any sort of examples of how this comes up in your faith community. You know,
Sure.
when your folks come to you and say, "Why am I suffering?" It can be easy to go up here and then have them say, "Yeah, okay, but why am I suffering?" Right? You know, so. I think it'd be interesting to hear that as well. But also feel free to share your questions.
I think at least there's a number of ways to respond to that. But in our congregation, we don't necessarily hear the why am I suffering, but what can be done about this suffering that I'm presently in, and it is easy, kind of going back to Rabbi Jonathan saying, well, sometimes the common response is, we'll just pray about it. And we don't want to minimize that. We don't want to delineate the power of prayer. But the church has a responsibility, and I'm sure you guys will have some agreement here, is that the church at least has a responsibility to say, in light of your suffering, we are not going to give up on you, and we're not going to give up on you because you are God's creation, and because you are God's creation, we want to worship God, the Creator, and the only way for us to do that, at least from a church perspective, the Christian perspective, is we will never see the fullness of that kind of love and that kind of relationship without recognizing and supporting the love and the impact that Christ gave us by walking alongside us. And so we're just following that example.
Okay. So I'll throw in a recent example. So the other day I was talking to someone, and we recently here in Houston, it was a friend of his. They had actually he went missing last year, and they just this year found his body. Actually, turns out that he was he's actually murdered, and so this was a lot for this young man who had come to me. He said, we went back for a long time. We were best friends, and I'm just having a really hard time just navigating this. Like, I understand it's a test, and I understand that, I get it on a kind of a surface level, right? But just the actual dealing with the fact that, I've lost him and I won't see him, it's really hard for me, And so it goes back to that whole idea of, we're not, yes, again, we're not saying like, okay, we'll just pray and you'll be good. Of course, we tell them like, yeah, don't forget, make dua, supplicate to God. But at the same time, it's to remind the person of why we are here, that your life, in fact, has meaning. And that if this wasn't a purpose in your life, then in a sense, you'd be in a worse state because you wouldn't have any sort of meaning. You wouldn't have any sort of objective, nowhere to go. It's just, you'd be in a worse state. Yes, I get the idea that you are, it's tough. But keep in mind, sometimes it's important to speak or think about things as alternatives as well, right? Like, what is the alternative, right? Sometimes we like to think about, well, I'm in this state, I'm suffering, and so we see the here and the now without kind of extending our vision beyond the here and the now. So one of the things that the Quran mentions is that when someone passes away or when someone's tested really deeply, the Quran says, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un," that indeed to God we belong and to God is the return. right? So at the end of the day, everything that we are, if we truly believe that God is the creator of everything, then he created us, he created our friends, he created everything around us, and he therefore is the as we say, Malik. He is the owner of everything. And with that said, that he has this deep wisdom that it's important for us to now go back to that and understand like our purpose, right? And refresh like this idea of our purpose. In fact, one of the objectives of the 5 daily prayers is to constantly refresh the idea of why are we here? Your life has meaning, and it's not just that the suffering is meaningless. You know, that God has put you here to worship him, and part of that worship is to be tested, and part of that worship is trying your best to pass that test. Because if you do, then you have eternal bliss, which adds to the idea of meaning in your life. So that was just something that came up recently with a young man that came to me.
It's powerful stuff. I keep coming back to this idea of gratitude, which in terms of recovery, and I do a lot of trauma work and work with first responders as well as in a community that is generally aging and dealing with a lot of loss and illness of all sorts of ways. And that idea of gratitude is so central, and it's fascinating. I think Fahd will particularly appreciate this. I mean, we've only got 3 regulated, prayers, but then we have like a bedtime prayer. So there's 4, and then there's blessing before and after eating. But yeah, basically, yeah, we got one upped by Islam. That's cool. No problem. But if you do all of those prayers, if you say all those prayers and you say all the prayers that are supposed to be said in those prayers, you say, "Blessed is God." So Baruch atah Hashem 100 times, no less than 100 times a day. And the idea being that, like, if you say, if you're saying thank you that many times and literally counting your blessings or filling yourself with a moment of gratitude 100 times a day, you're strengthening yourself. You're strengthening your resilience and your ability to endure whatever hardship you might encounter. Having that base of gratitude is so critical. I mean, that's really spoken to me in recent years as well in the Houston area and all the things that we've gone through as a larger community, as a smaller community. I mean, today there was a mass shooting in Vienna, Jewish community. So, thoughts and prayers but this idea of like, wow. And if I may throw one thing on top of that, which I find really interesting, and it's not a religious thing per se, but it's a psychological thing. Like I think most Jews, by law, I am neurotic. And I spend a lot of time worrying and a lot of anxiety. And many people can relate to that. I don't think that's a uniquely Jewish experience, especially, today. We do a lot of what if thinking. What if this happens? What if that happens? What will I do? What will I do? And the challenge that was presented by a psychologist a few years ago in an article I read was, no, flip that around and say, what if good things didn't happen? Instead of saying, what if this bad thing happens, actually sit there and spend a few moments saying, what if I never met my wife? What if I never had this person that I'm grieving? What if I never had that experience? It's a particularly interesting way to take that worry and actually flip it from worry to gratitude and spend your time thinking about what would your life have been like if all the good things that have happened to you didn't happen. And you're like, wow, that's true. I mean, and those are things that actually happened as opposed to things that haven't happened. So I don't know.
Well, that's brilliant, man. I love that.
I wish I could claim it. Yeah.
Always looking at just taking the view of always being optimistic. It's so important. Like you said, especially in the next day or two, it's going to be even more important. So and it's really interesting the various personality types you have. I mean, some people are just kind of more naturally pessimistic with things. So they're always looking at kind of the negative, the glass being half empty, right? And then you have people that are naturally, glasses half full type people. And then my wife and I are kind of polar opposites in that area. So I'm more of the glass is half full, and I'm always trying to look at the positive things of things. And I think that drives her crazy because I'm always like, well, it could have been. And she's just like, oh my God, just stop. And then she starts listing all this negative stuff. So I recently found out that her blood type is B positive. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Your blood type is B positive? I mean, that's like a sign if I ever saw it, man. Anyway, no, that was
Mine's
beautiful.
actually
Thank you,
B
Rabbi.
negative, and I say that explains it.
Yeah,
So, I come
no,
by it
I just
often.
wanted to say I appreciate that. That's beautiful, Rabbi.
Yeah, and I apologize for technical difficulties and dropping out there for a second. And I don't know if this was referenced, but noted Houstonian Brene Brown talks about how in her studies, right, the one thing that most predicts resilience is gratitude, without question. So that really tracks with Rabbi, what you were saying. I know we're about out of time. If everyone wants to give a closing 30-second thought, that'd be great. Pastor, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, kind of along those lines of, things that are half full, half empty. Certainly go back and forth with those, just depending on the situation or the mood I'm in, the temporary mood I'm in. And I have to remind myself that it's not necessarily half empty or half full. There's something in there. And whatever is placed in there is because of what God has given. Or what is not there is because what God has taken away. And as I was listening to that, I was also reminded of what King David had mentioned in Psalm 23 at the very end. He says to God, he says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And if we were to look at King David's life, we would see that he had the highest of highs and lowest of lows. And those lows were certainly at times of his own misgivings and his own misdeeds. However, he was able to still see that perspective that regardless of the situation he was in, that God's goodness and his love was going to continue with him. And that was what kept him moving and what kept him able to live this life. And as from a Christian perspective, we see that that is a foreshadowing of God's goodness through Christ. And I will certainly unabashedly share that if we were to really get a hold of how to deal with suffering, that will come through the goodness of Christ and his example towards us. And with that, I do want to just thank, even though we may have different perspectives here, the ability to have this kind of conversation, that we can do this with civility and still recognize each other as neighbors in our community that have a desire for each of us to do well and those that we lead to do well also.
Amen to that. Pastor, thank you. Rabbi?
Goodness, I'm reminded, I don't want to gild the lily. I think there's so much wisdom that's been shared that, trying to sum it up, just that I think with all things, there's just certain wisdom in the old folktale. I believe, even though it's probably claimed by a lot of cultures, there's certainly an old Jewish version of it. I think it originates in Persia, but it's the idea that, this too shall pass. So it's kind of like the Texas weather, if you don't like it, stick around, it's going to change. And like, suffering is always temporary. I mean, it may not seem that way, but it's something to bear in mind that there's larger things at play, and maintaining that sense of hope and trust that and that balance is critical. So, I mean, this kind of thing helps us all keep balance. So I appreciate it. One river, many wells.
Amen. And I also want to just note before we turn to Fahad, we've gotten some great comments. Laura, thank you. We got a comment from Sanul. Learned a lot from different perspectives. We need to continue to have this kind of event more often. Loved it. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here with us. Robert, thank you as well for your comment just now. Fahad, go ahead.
Sure. So let me just kind of go off of the idea of gratitude. I just want to say thank you to everyone that, that's here. One of the things that I think is really important is aside from the actual substance of the conversation itself, the fact that we're having a conversation in a civil manner. I think right now, just being in the United States with everything that's going on, this is something that we need to take to our own communities, where we're talking about, conservatives and liberals and this and that and voting, and and it can really be tiresome, and some of those conversations get to be a lot less than civil. And so I think it's just wonderful that we're able to come together, have share our different perspectives. So let me just say thank you to all of you for sharing your perspectives, coming here and spending your time. I'll just end with a kind of a parable that an Islamic scholar gave, and it kind of summarizes how to kind of view the world when it comes to suffering. He said that if you ever if you have little children and you kind of toss them up, which I don't know if this is legal, so maybe I shouldn't be mentioning this, but anyway, so when you toss them up, on their way up, sometimes they're kind of a bit, they're like reaching to the apex, right, to the height, and they're really scared. And then when they come back to your arms, they're like laughing, and they say, "Oh, Baba, do it again," right? And so it's like you toss them up, and they're just like, "Oh, scared," but then they come back to your arms, and so the scholar, he said that, look, our lives are like that child. That when you're in the air, everything's like, oh, but don't worry, the hands that you're coming back to are very secure hands, and those are the hands of God. So, with that said, with everything that we're going through, at the end, that's where we're going to go back to. And so, it's incumbent upon us to go back to God and refresh that within ourselves. So I'll stop there. So.
It's beautiful. Thank you. I love that. Thank you so much, Fahad, Rabbi Jonathan, Pastor Chris. This is a time of as you all have just mentioned, a lot of divisiveness or seeming divisiveness in our country. And so it's more important than ever that we have these kinds of conversations, realize that a lot of that divisiveness is fueled by just not actually having accurate perceptions about who other people are. And when you work together, when you talk together, we can change that narrative, I think, in a really profound way. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Have a great night. Have a great election day tomorrow. Go vote if you haven't voted yet. And we'll look forward to being with you again.
All right, guys. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Be well.